The morning mist clung to the acacia trees like ancestral spirits reluctant to leave, and Amara knew something was wrong before she heard the sound. Her bare feet paused on the red earth path she had walked for 37 years. The same path her grandmother had worn smooth with countless journeys to the sacred grove. The silence pressed against her eardrums. No birdsong, no rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. Nothing but the whisper of wind through thorns. Then she heard it. The growl of engines cutting through the ancient quiet like machetes through silk. Amara's fingers tightened around the leather pouch at her waist, feeling the familiar weight of the ceremonial seeds within. Today was the day of the awakening ritual, when the young girls of her village would receive their first blessing from the ancestors. She was the keeper of the path, the bridge between the living and those who had walked before, and nothing, not drought, not disease, not the government officials who occasionally came with their papers and promises, had ever prevented her from fulfilling this sacred duty. The sound grew louder, mechanical and harsh against the organic symphony of the wilderness. Through the morning haze, she glimpsed flashes of olive green moving between the trees. Military vehicles. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her steps never faltered. She had survived civil war, colonial occupation, and the slow erosion of traditional ways. These strangers, whoever they were, would not stop her from reaching the grove. As she crested the small hill that overlooked the valley, Amara saw them clearly for the first time. 3 military trucks had stopped at the base of the sacred baobab tree, their engines still running, diesel fumes creating an unholy incense in the pure morning air. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms moved around the vehicles with the casual efficiency of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. But it was the 4th vehicle that made her blood run cold, a smaller truck loaded with surveying equipment and men in civilian clothes pointing instruments at her most sacred places, the spots where her people had worshipped for 1,000 years, where the bones of her ancestors rested beneath flowering shrubs, where the old stories lived in the very stones. One of the civilians looked up and saw her standing silhouetted against the morning sky. He pointed, and several soldiers turned their attention toward her. She could have melted back into the bush, could have taken the hidden paths known only to her people, could have returned to the village to warn the elders and let others decide what should be done. Instead, Amara straightened her shoulders and began walking down the hill toward them. The colorful kanga cloth wrapped around her body caught the early light, and the wooden beads her mother had carved clicked softly at her throat. She moved with the measured pace of ceremony, neither hurrying nor hesitating, her eyes fixed on the grove beyond the vehicles. The soldiers watched her approach with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She appeared to be alone, unarmed, just another village woman going about her daily business. They had no way of knowing that she carried within her the accumulated wisdom of generations, that her seemingly fragile frame housed a spirit forged by centuries of survival, that her quiet determination had been shaped by forces far older and more powerful than their guns and orders. As she drew closer, the morning mist began to lift, revealing the full scope of what they intended. The sacred grove, the resting place of her ancestors, the heart of her people's spiritual world, was being measured and mapped for destruction, and she was the only thing standing in their way. The commanding officer stepped forward as Amara reached the perimeter of the grove, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps the age of her eldest son, with eyes that held the particular hardness of someone who had learned to follow orders without question. His uniform bore insignia she didn't recognize, but authority was a language she understood regardless of its symbols. "Ma'am, you need to move along," he said in accented English, then repeated himself in broken Swahili. "This area is restricted." Amara stopped walking but did not retreat. She studied his face, reading the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted between her and the sacred baobab behind him. He was nervous, she realized. Not afraid of her, what threat could one elderly woman pose? But uncertain about his mission. Uncomfortable with something he didn't fully understand. "I am Amara, daughter of Casey, keeper of the ancient paths," she replied in her own language, her voice carrying the formal cadence of ritual. She watched his confusion and switched to English. "This is sacred ground. You cannot be here." The officer's expression hardened. "We have government authorization. Mining survey. You have 10 minutes to clear the area before we begin." Mining. The word hit her like a physical blow. She had heard rumors in the regional market, whispers of foreign companies, with government connections seeking to strip the earth of its treasures, but she had never imagined they would dare touch this place, where the spirits of her people dwelt among the ancient trees. Behind the officer, the surveyors were already setting up their equipment. One man directed a metal detector toward the base of the baobab tree, its electronic beeping a mechanical heartbeat against the organic pulse of the grove. Another unrolled maps and pointed toward the hillsides where centuries of her ancestors lay buried beneath carefully tended gardens. 10 minutes, the officer repeated, checking his watch. But something in Amara's expression made him pause. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, with the dignity of someone who had never learned to bow, or the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes that suggested she understood far more than her simple appearance might suggest. Amara reached into her leather pouch and withdrew a handful of seeds, each one blessed by generations of ceremony, each one carrying the prayers of mothers for their daughters' futures. She let them fall through her fingers onto the red earth at her feet and began to speak in the old language, her voice rising and falling in the rhythm of ancient invocation. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. The surveyors paused in their work. Even the birds seemed to fall silent as her words carved through the morning air, calling upon powers that predated their weapons, their governments, their entire understanding of ownership and control. "What is she doing?" one of the younger soldiers asked, his voice tight with unease. "Prayer," the officer replied, but his hand moved closer to his weapon. He had been in enough conflicts to recognize the moment when a simple operation began to complicate itself. The old woman's chanting was having an effect on his men, making them remember their own grandmothers, their own forgotten traditions. Amara's voice grew stronger, pulling strength from the earth beneath her feet, from the ancestors who walked beside her, from the generations of women who had stood in similar moments of crisis and found ways to endure. She was not just one woman facing a squad of armed men. She was the living embodiment of her people's refusal to disappear quietly into history. The metal detector's beeping grew more insistent, and one of the surveyors called out excitedly in a language she didn't recognize. He gestured toward the readings on his instruments, and the civilians began talking rapidly among themselves. Their excitement was palpable. They had found what they were looking for. But as Amara's prayer reached its crescendo, something else happened. The wind picked up, rustling through the leaves of the baobab tree with a sound like whispered warnings. Clouds gathered overhead with unnatural speed, casting shadows across the grove. And in the distance, almost too faint to hear, came the sound of voices, her people, awakened by some instinct older than fear, moving through the forest toward the sacred place that had always been their sanctuary. The first raindrops began to fall as Amara completed her invocation, each drop striking the red earth with the weight of judgment. The officer cursed under his breath and gestured for his men to take shelter under the vehicles. But the rain came, harder, driven by winds that seemed to emerge from the very heart of the grove. Through the downpour, shapes emerged from the forest, men, women, and children of Amara's village, moving through the storm as if summoned by her prayers. They came silently, arranging themselves in a circle around the grove, their colorful clothing bright against the gray curtain of rain. Elders leaned on walking sticks carved from sacred wood. Young mothers carried infants wrapped in traditional blankets. Teenagers stood shoulder to shoulder with their grandparents, united by something deeper than blood. The commanding officer's radio crackled to life, and Amara caught fragments of urgent conversation in languages she didn't recognize. The voices sounded alarmed, speaking of complications and unexpected resistance. The surveyors huddled under a tarp, their expensive equipment useless in the sudden deluge, their excitement dampened by the realization that they were no longer dealing with a simple operation. "Tell them to disperse," the officer shouted to Amara over the sound of rain and thunder. "This doesn't have to become a problem." But Amara was no longer listening to him. Her attention had turned to her people, to the faces she had known since childhood, to the children who represented the future of traditions stretching back to the beginning of memory. She saw Jomo, the village blacksmith whose grandfather had forged the first tools used to tend this grove. She saw Asha, the herb gatherer, whose knowledge of healing plants had been passed down through 17 generations of women. She saw dozens of others, each carrying within them irreplaceable pieces of their collective heritage. And she saw something else in their faces, the recognition that this moment would define everything that came after. They could submit, accept the inevitable, watch their sacred places become holes in the ground in service of distant prophets. Or they could stand, knowing the cost, knowing the risks, choosing to fight for something that could never be rebuilt. Once destroyed, the oldest man in the village, Bakari, stepped forward from the circle. His walking stick tapped against the wet stones as he approached Amara, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 90 years lived in service to his people. "Sister," he said in their language, "what do the ancestors tell you?" Amara looked into his weathered face and saw reflected there the same question that burned in her own heart. The practical part of her mind cataloged the impossibility of their situation. Dozens of unarmed villagers facing trained soldiers, ancient traditions confronting modern force, the powerless challenging those who held all the conventional advantages. But the deeper part of her spirit, the part that had been shaped by generations of women who had survived everything history could inflict upon them, spoke with quiet certainty. "They tell me," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm, "that some things are worth more than safety. That there are places in this world that cannot be bought or sold, cannot be measured or mapped, cannot be reduced to holes in the ground. They tell me that we are not just guarding trees and stones, we are guarding the memory of who we are." The soldiers were growing increasingly agitated. Radio communications continued, and Amara caught the word reinforcements, repeated several times. The officer checked his watch, then looked toward the road as if expecting additional vehicles to arrive. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and what had begun as a routine survey operation was transforming into something none of them had been trained to handle. One of the surveyors approached the officer, gesturing frantically toward his instruments. Even through the rain, Amara could see the excitement in his movements, the urgency of someone who had discovered something significant. The metal detectors had found deposits beneath the grove that exceeded their expectations, enough to make this operation extremely profitable, enough to justify removing any obstacles that stood in the way. The officer nodded grimly and turned, back toward the villagers. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new edge of determination. "You have 1 hour to clear this area," he announced, his words cutting through the rain like a blade. "After that, we will use whatever force is necessary to complete our mission." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy as the storm clouds above. Amara felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her shoulders, the accumulated hopes and fears of her people crystallizing into this single moment of choice. Around the grove, her villagers stood motionless in the rain, waiting for her decision, trusting her to find a path through the darkness that was about to descend upon them. As the hour mark approached, the storm intensified with supernatural fury. Lightning split the sky in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, and thunder rolled across the valley like the voices of angry ancestors. The soldiers had taken positions, behind their vehicles, automatic weapons visible but not yet aimed directly at the villagers who continued their silent vigil around the grove. Amara stood at the center of it all, her wet clothing clinging to her frame, her gray hair streaming, with rainwater yet somehow appearing larger than her physical form, as if she had become a conduit for forces beyond the material world. The leather pouch at her waist pulsed with warmth despite the cold rain, and she could feel the presence of her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and all the women who had carried the responsibility of keeping the old ways alive. The commanding officer emerged from his shelter, radio in hand, speaking rapidly to his superiors. His voice carried fragments of frustration, more complicated than anticipated, and recommend postponement. But the responses he received clearly displeased him. His jaw tightened as he listened, and when he signed off, His expression had transformed into something harder, more dangerous. "Orders are orders," he muttered, then raised his voice to address his men. "Prepare to clear the area by force if necessary." The soldiers checked their weapons with mechanical precision, but Amara noticed something in their movements. A reluctance, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. One of the younger men kept glancing toward the villagers, his gaze lingering on the children who stood hand in hand with their grandparents, unflinching despite the storm and the implied threat of violence. It was then that the first miracle occurred, or what the soldiers would later struggle to explain in their official reports. The metal detectors, previously beeping with increasing urgency as they located precious deposits beneath the grove, suddenly fell silent. The surveyors frantically adjusted their equipment, but the instruments registered nothing. The rich veins of minerals that had justified this entire operation had somehow vanished from their readings. "Check the equipment," the lead surveyor shouted over the thunder. "Recalibrate everything." But even as his team scrambled to diagnose the malfunction, a second phenomenon manifested. The rain, which had been falling equally across the entire area, began to concentrate with laser precision on the military vehicles and equipment while leaving the villagers relatively dry. Steam rose from the overheated engines as cold rain struck hot metal, and electrical systems began to spark and fail. The commanding officer's radio emitted a burst of static, then died completely. The truck engines sputtered and fell silent one by one. Even the flashlights and personal radios carried by individual soldiers flickered and went dark, leaving them isolated from their command structure and dependent on increasingly unreliable technology. "What the hell is happening here?" one soldier whispered to another, his voice tight with superstitious fear. Amara stepped forward, moving through the rain-soaked clearing with serene confidence. When she spoke, her voice somehow carried clearly to every person present, cutting through the storm as if she commanded the very elements. "You come here with your machines and your weapons," she said, her words addressed to the officer but intended for all. "You think power comes from metal and explosives, from papers signed by men who have never set foot on this sacred earth. But there are forces in this world older than your governments, deeper than your understanding." She gestured toward the baobab tree, its ancient trunk scarred by lightning but still standing, still reaching toward the sky with branches that had sheltered her people for 1,000 years. "This tree was old when your ancestors were learning to forge their first weapons. These stones beneath your feet remember the footsteps of kings and queens whose names are carved in no history books, but whose spirits still walk among us. You cannot measure such things with your instruments. You cannot claim them with your papers. You cannot destroy them without consequences that will follow you long after you have returned to your homes and forgotten our faces." The storm reached its crescendo as she spoke, and in the next flash of lightning, something impossible became visible to every person present. Standing among the villagers, translucent but unmistakable, were dozens of additional figures, men and women in traditional dress that spanned centuries, their faces marked by dignity and defiance, their eyes fixed upon the intruders with expressions of implacable judgment. Several soldiers cried out in alarm, weapons raised but uncertain what to aim at. The commanding officer stood frozen, his training providing no protocols for confronting the supernatural. Even the surveyors abandoned their equipment, backing toward their vehicles with faces pale with terror. In that moment of universal recognition that they had stumbled into something far beyond their comprehension or control, Amara raised her hands toward the storm-dark sky and spoke the words her grandmother had taught her, the words that called upon the deepest protections of her people, the words that had never been spoken lightly because their power was absolute and their consequences irreversible. The words of binding left Amara's lips like birds taking flight, each syllable carrying the accumulated power of 1,000 years of unbroken tradition. As she spoke, the storm began to subside with unnatural precision, the winds dying to whispers, the rain slowing to a gentle mist that caught the late morning light like scattered diamonds. But the most profound change was not in the weather. It was in the land itself. Where moments before the surveyor's instruments had detected rich mineral deposits worthy of industrial exploitation, now the earth revealed its true nature. The red soil beneath their feet pulsed with a deeper vitality, and the very air seemed to thicken with presence, as if the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had become permeable. The commanding officer found his voice first, though it emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. "What did you do?" Amara lowered her hands, and when she looked at him, her eyes held the depth of someone who had just performed an act that could never be undone. "I have bound this place to the eternal realm of the ancestors. It can no longer be mapped by your instruments, claimed by your governments, or touched by your machines. It exists now in the space between worlds, protected by forces that your science cannot measure or your weapons cannot defeat." As if to demonstrate the truth of her words, one of the surveyors attempted to restart his metal detector. The device powered on but emitted only silence, its screen displaying readings that made no sense: negative depths, impossible mineral compositions, coordinates that placed them simultaneously in multiple locations across the continent. The trucks remained dead, their sophisticated engines transformed into silent metal sculptures. Radio equipment that had functioned perfectly hours before now produced only whispers in languages no living person could identify. Even the soldiers' watches had stopped, their digital displays frozen at the moment Amara had spoken the words of binding. "This isn't possible," the lead surveyor muttered, frantically checking and rechecking his instruments. The geological surveys, the satellite imagery, everything showed massive deposits right here. Bakari, the village elder, stepped forward from the circle of witnesses. His ancient face bore an expression of profound satisfaction, as if he had been waiting his entire life to see this moment. "Young man," he said to the surveyor in careful English, "your machines can only see what exists in your world, but there have always been places that belong to deeper realities, spaces where the ancestors maintain their watch over those who remember them. You came here seeking to rape the earth for profit. Instead, you have witnessed the awakening of powers your civilization has forgotten." The commanding officer made one final attempt to assert control, reaching for his weapon with trembling hands. But as his fingers closed around the grip, the metal became so cold it burned his skin, forcing him to release it with a cry of pain. The other soldiers made no move to support him. They could see what he apparently could not, that they were completely outmatched by forces beyond their training or comprehension. "You need to leave," Amara said, her voice gentle now but carrying absolute authority. "Your vehicles will start once you cross the boundary of the sacred grove. Your equipment will function again when you are beyond the reach of the ancestors' protection. But you can never return here. This place is closed to you and all who would harm it." As if responding to her words, the clouds parted overhead, revealing a sky of such brilliant blue it seemed to vibrate with its own light. The ancient baobab tree stood magnificent in the returned sunshine, its bark gleaming with moisture, its branches reaching toward heaven like arms raised in celebration. The retreat was not graceful. Soldiers stumbled over their own feet in their haste to reach the vehicles. Surveyors abandoned thousands of dollars worth of equipment that had become worse than useless, actively harmful in its refusal to acknowledge the reality around them. The commanding officer cast one last look toward Amara as he climbed into the lead truck, and she saw in his expression not just defeat, but a fundamental shift in his understanding of what was possible in the world. True to her word, the engines started as soon as the convoy crossed the invisible boundary that marked the edge of the grove's protection. The trucks disappeared down the red dirt road in clouds of dust, carrying their occupants back to a world where maps matched reality and instruments told the truth about what lay beneath the earth. As the sound of engines faded into silence, Amara turned to face her people. They looked at her with expressions that mingled awe with deep satisfaction, understanding that they had witnessed something that would be spoken of for generations. The young girls who had come for the awakening ritual were no longer children. They had participated in the defense of their most sacred heritage and emerged transformed. "The ceremony," Amara said simply, reaching into her leather pouch for the blessed seeds that would mark the beginning of the girl's spiritual journey. "The ancestors are waiting." As her people gathered around the base of the baobab tree, organizing themselves for the ritual that had brought them together in the first place. Amara felt the presence of her grandmother one final time. A warm hand on her shoulder, a whispered blessing in the old language, a confirmation that the sacred grove would remain protected not just for years or decades, but for all the generations yet to come. The seeds fell into eager young palms, each one carrying the promise that some things in this world would never be for sale, never be destroyed, never be forgotten as long as there were people willing to stand between the sacred and those who would profane it for profit.